Okay, so I think we're ready to start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to pass it off to NDP Critic for Ethics, Charlie Angus, and the NDP Deputy Leader, Alexandre Boulerice. After they speak, we'll take a few questions from the media. To ask a question, please use your raise hand function, or you can send me a message in the chat. Please note that this is being recorded. If you would like a copy of the recording, just send me a message in the chat. Bonjour, merci de vous rejoindre à nous aujourd'hui. Je vais céder la parole à Charlie Angus et à Alexandre Boulerice. Après leur intervention, nous allons répondre aux questions des médias. Pour poser une question, veuillez utiliser la fonction lever la main ou m'envoyer un message. Okay, over to you, Charlie.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to begin responding to the Privacy Commissioner's report, as will my colleague, Mr. Boulerice. We will then have some comments on the ethics report that was released this morning on the WE scandal. First off, I'd like to say a deep thank you, sincere thank you to Privacy Commissioner Daniel Therrien for his excellent work, as always, in defending the privacy rights of Canadians. Facial recognition technology represents a Rubicon moment in the fundamental notions of privacy, personhood, and civil rights. The ability of a person to walk in the public square without being digitally identified, tracked, or targeted, either by corporate interests, creepy perverts, or the state, is no longer the stuff of science fiction. It is happening now. And Parliament really needs to get serious about what are the rules around the use of facial recognition technology by state actors, by the police, by individuals, by corporate interests. So I really thank Daniel Therrien for his incredible work on this. I'd like to say, in response, can the tools that are available through facial recognition technology, could they aid police? Absolutely. But could it be a technology that is open to massive abuse, racial targeting, and profile? Very, very clearly. And this is why I was so concerned when I learned that the very controversial company Clearview AI was setting up shop in Canada. I was very concerned that they were not even following Canadian law, and I'd asked Mr. Therrien for an investigation. One of the things that concerned us is whether or not the police were using this technology. And I followed up asking Mr. Therrien to investigate whether or not the RCMP was using this technology. So what do we learn from this report? We learn that the RCMP lied. They lied to the Canadian public. They lied to the Privacy Commissioner. They were using Clearview AI and they pretended they weren't. It's not acceptable. They lied about how they used it. When they were caught, they said they were only using it in child exploitation cases. But we know now that they only used it in child exploitation cases in a very small percentage, maybe 5 or 6%. How they used it and what they used it for in the vast majority of other cases, we have no idea. We know that there's a huge discrepancy between what the RCMP claimed, the amount of times they used it, and what Clearview AI says they used it. And I think one of the most disturbing things is that the RCMP failed to do any due diligence on whether or not Clearview AI was even in compliance with Canadian laws. They were more than willing to accept the promise of some company and disregard whether or not it broke Canadian law. I think this is a very disturbing pattern because we see with Pornhub, the RCMP has refused to do investigations, has been more than willing to accept the word of the company. In fact, talks about voluntary compliance with the law. The RCMP really needs to explain their behavior in dealing with these kind of corporations. The RCMP needs to be accountable for this misuse of this technology. But I think the bigger issue here is what is the federal government going to do? Because Bill C-11 is now before Parliament, and Mr. Therrien has raised serious questions about whether or not the Liberals' so-called privacy rights bill is actually a bill to undermine the rights of Canadian citizens, to make it possible for companies like Clearview AI to operate. And Minister Bill Blair, when I asked him about whether or not they would maintain the laws to protect us from abuse of facial recognition technology, Mr. Blair said that he thought it was really important for this government to give the police the tools that they required. I am asking the government to explain why they would consider undermining the privacy laws that exist right now as we're dealing with much more invasive technology, such as facial recognition technology, because what is used and abused by the police right now will be used and abused by citizens who want to track other people. It will be used and abused by corporations. The tracking of citizens must have clear rules around it. The police must be expected to follow the law of the land, and if not, there has to be consequences. So this has raised some really disturbing questions, but I really want to thank the Privacy Commissioner for shining a light on the failure of the RCMP to follow the law and the fact that we are now in a very much a wild west in terms of digital tracking of citizens, and we need to have laws in place to protect citizens.
Thank you, Charlie. Alex, I'll pass it over to you now.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Merci à Charlie aussi. Vous savez, au NPD, on prend extrêmement au sérieux toutes les notions de protection de renseignements personnels et de protection à la vie privée des citoyens puis des citoyennes. Et comme le fait mon collègue, M. Angus, je dois remercier tout le travail que le commissaire Terrien a fait dans ce dossier-là, particulièrement avec l'étude que nous, le NPD, on avait demandé sur l'utilisation des technologies de reconnaissance faciale par les forces policières, notamment le GRC. Vous savez, l'utilisation de technologies d'intelligence artificielle de reconnaissance faciale ne fait plus partie des films de science-fiction ou des romans de science-fiction, mais fait partie maintenant de nos vies. Et c'est pour ça que le NPD, on a demandé, est-ce que la GRC l'utilise? Et ce qu'on a appris, c'est que, bon, la GRC a nié au départ utiliser la technologie de la compagnie Clearview AI. Par la suite, ils ont fini par admettre qu'ils l'utilisaient, mais ils l'ont fait en ne s'étant pas assuré de manière préalable que les pratiques de la compagnie étaient compatibles avec la loi, ce qui est quand même assez hallucinant de la part d'une force policière, la GRC, qui sous-traite à une compagnie qui fait de la reconnaissance faciale, mais qui ne s'assure pas que les droits des citoyens sont respectés, que la vie privée est respectée et que l'utilisation de cette technologie-là correspond au respect de la loi, alors que c'est ceux qui sont supposés de faire respecter la loi dans le pays. C'est extrêmement préoccupant sur maintenant qui peut utiliser cette technologie-là et dans quelles circonstances, et pour la police aussi. On ne dit pas qu'elle ne doit jamais pouvoir l'utiliser, mais ça doit se faire de manière transparente et également sous supervision judiciaire. Là, ce n'était pas le cas, c'était complètement caché et en plus de ça, la GRC a essayé de nier la vérité au départ, n'eût été de l'enquête du commissaire Terrien et de la demande que nous, le NPD, on a fait. Alors, ça détruit le lien de confiance entre la GRC et la population, entre les Canadiens et les Québécois et la GRC. Et là, ça commence à s'accumuler pour la GRC. Non seulement il y a le racisme systémique, non seulement il y a les scandales d'inconduite et d'agression sexuelle et la volonté de balayer tout ça en dessous du tapis. Et là, en plus de ça, on a le non-respect de la loi dans l'utilisation de la reconnaissance faciale avec une nouvelle compagnie qui est Clearview AI. Donc, le gouvernement libéral de Justin Trudeau doit faire énormément pour rétablir la confiance des gens envers cette institution-là qui est la GRC, parce que leur gestion de la GRC depuis 6 ans est absolument pitoyable. Plus on en apprend, pire c'est. Et en ce qui concerne l'utilisation de la technologie faciale, mais ce qui était illégal hier pourrait devenir légal demain avec le nouveau projet de loi libéral C11 qui prévoit que, oui, ça va être possible d'utiliser cette technologie-là, d'utiliser des compagnies comme Clearview AI. Alors, les libéraux sont en train de rendre légal ce qui, hier encore, transgressait la loi et transgressait le droit à la vie privée des citoyens et des citoyennes. Je pense qu'on doit être préoccupé. Je pense que c'est un signal d'alarme qui vient d'être lancé par le commissaire Terrien et on doit tous être extrêmement vigilants et faire le travail, particulièrement le gouvernement libéral. Merci.
Thank you, Alexandre. I'm going to make a few comments on the ethics report. It took us nearly a year to get this report done. We faced incredible levels of interference with the government party, numerous filibusters. The government actually shut down Parliament at the height of the pandemic as we were conducting our work. We had numerous difficulties getting documents. The Liberals refused to have witnesses appear who were germane to the study. We had to issue a number of and threatened to issue a number of legal summons to actually get testimony from the key players. And what did we find? We find that there was a extraordinary level of insider access afforded to the Kielburger brothers, that there was no other group who were given the opportunity to bid on this project. No other group was spoken to. This was not, as the Liberals told us, something that came from the civil service. In fact, I think they tried to throw hardworking civil servants under the bus by making them shoulder the blame. This was driven out of Bill Morneau's office, and certainly Minister Bartosz Chagger played a key role in key meetings that were not made available to the public because the Kielburgers were not registered to lobby. Minister Chagger did not give information about the April 17th meeting, where pretty much the Kielburger group was given the inside track. Over the course of our committee work and with the work with finance, what did we find out? We found out that Bill Morneau had received over $40,000 in flights and trips from the Kielburger brothers. And we then, of course, found out later about the huge levels of insider access that the Kielburger brothers were given. Our committee found out that the Kielburger group had enormous numbers of meetings, and yet they weren't even registered to lobby. They were forced to change course, of course, after this came out. And then we found out that we were not dealing with the so-called We Charity at all. We were dealing with a shell company that had been set up by the Kielburger brothers. What we were not able to find out at the end of the day is actually how this group operates. Despite numerous requests and demands for documents, we have no clear picture of the financial structure of the We Group, what is for profit, what is private, how many of these companies that they have, how many side hustles are being run, who owns them, whether or not they're run by their brothers or for what purposes, how their real estate holdings are. And this is concerning because we had the federal government ready to sign a deal that was between $500 million and $912 million with this group, with no due diligence to what they had set up as a shell company. The normal practices that should have been done, the normal questions that should have been asked, the hard questions, the pushing questions, whether or not these guys were even able to deliver this program, it wasn't done. And this is not to blame the civil service, and this is not to hide behind the fact that in a pandemic, quick decisions had to be made. It keeps coming back. We saw this in document after document to the close relationship between the Kielburgers and Morneau and Chagger, and the belief in the larger Liberal government that this was a group that was very much blessed because of their relationship to the Prime Minister. It goes back to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's judgment. The fact that his family were traveling with We, were ambassadors for We, the family members were being paid by We. It created a culture where the normal questions that should have been asked about whether this was a good use of taxpayers' money and whether this group could have actually delivered the goods, those questions weren't asked. So I'm very proud of the work of the committee. I think this is a very clear report. I think it will stand in well stead to the Ethics Commissioner's report. And now Canadians, I would like to think we can change the channel, but until we know whether or not the government is going to start putting in place proper conflict of interest screens, until we know whether or not the government's going to get serious about changes to the huge loopholes in the Lobbying Act, and until we know that Liberal insiders aren't going to be able to just walk in and get contracts without the proper due diligence, we may be seeing repeats of this in the future. The Prime Minister needs to change the culture of insider access and government for the friends and pals and cronies of the Liberal Party. Thank you.
Merci, merci Charlie. Je vais maintenant y aller sur le rapport du comité sur le scandale de We Charity. Je vois encore mon cher collègue, M. Angus, sur mon écran. Je ne sais pas si c'est moi qui ai la parole maintenant.
Oui, je peux vous voir.
Oui. OK, merci. Sur le rapport sur le scandale de We Charity, évidemment, le comité a fait tout un travail, mais qui essentiellement, selon moi, résume la pensée politique du Parti libéral du Canada et qui s'appelle « Un chum, c'est un chum ». Et on ne s'enfarge pas dans les fleurs du tapis. On est là pour les petits copains, pour les amis super riches. on se gratte dans le dos, on se renvoie à l'ascenseur et on ne se préoccupe pas trop d'éthique. Et c'est assez clair que ce qu'on soupçonnait depuis le départ, c'est avéré. C'est-à-dire que les Kielburger avaient un accès privilégié, direct, régulier avec le bureau du ministre des Finances, M. Morneau, qu'ils se sont servis de leur contact pour avoir un contrat sans même avoir d'appel d'offres à cause des relations familiales et amicales qu'ils avaient avec la famille Trudeau et les Morneau en particulier. Les libéraux ont essayé de balayer tout ça en dessous du tapis, d'étouffer l'affaire. Ils ont commencé à blâmer les hauts fonctionnaires ou la fonction publique de manière assez dégoûtante à mon avis. Et ensuite de ça, ils ont même été jusqu'à fermer le Parlement pour éviter de continuer à répondre à des questions qui étaient embarrassantes. Et parlant d'embarrassant, le comité fait des bonnes recommandations. Mais pour les libéraux, c'est embarrassant. Écoutez, dorénavant, le comité recommande qu'un examen sur les possibles conflits d'intérêts devrait être fait lorsque le cabinet se prononce sur l'octroi d'un contrat d'une telle ampleur à une entité privée. Ça veut dire qu'on sait très bien qu'on ne peut pas se fier au jugement des libéraux. On ne peut pas penser qu'ils vont réaliser eux-mêmes qu'ils se mettent en conflit d'intérêts. Ils ne voient pas le conflit d'intérêts. On va être obligé de mettre un cadre à côté d'eux autres pour vérifier à chaque fois s'il n'y aurait pas un possible conflit d'intérêts parce qu'ils ne sont pas capables de le voir. Pour eux, c'est juste politique as usual. C'est normal, c'est comme ça qu'ils font de la politique, les libéraux. Alors, ça en dit beaucoup sur les jugements de M. Trudeau, Morneau et de l'ensemble du cabinet. Et le comité recommande aussi que, dorénavant, le ministre des Finances devrait subir un tel examen sur des possibles conflits d'intérêts à chaque fois qu'il prend une décision. Ça veut dire que, premièrement, nos lois sur les conflits d'intérêts sont désuètes et doivent être modernisées puis doivent être mises à jour, mais en s'en dit long sur les capacités de jugement des libéraux pour qui, évidemment, c'est normal de faire ça. C'est le buffet ouvert et c'est les cadeaux aux petits copains comme d'habitude. Et le comité est obligé de dire non, on devrait vous faire subir un examen à chaque fois parce qu'on ne vous fait pas confiance.
Thank you both. So we are now ready to take questions. Nous sommes maintenant prêts à répondre aux questions. As a reminder, to ask a question, please use the raised hand function in the bottom of the chat or send me a message in the chat. You'll get one question and one follow-up. Pour rappel, pour poser une question, veuillez utiliser la fonction lever la main ou m'envoyer un message. The first question is going to Colin Freeze. Colin, if you can unmute yourself, if you could just introduce yourself and say the name of your publication. Go ahead.
Yeah, Colin Freeze from the Globe and Mail. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Charlie, I watched you in February hammer the RCMP on child exploitation investigations for being too passive, for not doing enough to pull videos of unidentified minors on MindGeek Pornhub, for not running that down and initiating criminal cases. And here we are a few months later, where you sort of are hammering them from the opposite side for being too aggressive, for using an algorithmic tool. And obviously the privacy commissioner has a litany of well-founded criticisms about that. But I'm just wondering, given that you've seen the problem from both sides, I mean, the RCMP's only defense is that they mostly tried to use it for child exploitation investigations, the Clearview AI tool. Privacy commissioner doesn't know whether to believe them on that because it wasn't documented. But I'm just wondering, what's the constructive way forward? If you were, Solicitor General, how would you resolve these tensions to deal with the sort of problems you've spoken very eloquently about at the ethics community and the committee and the MindGeek Pornhub hearings, and also here we are with this sort of RCMP using an algorithmic tool that is unlawful. Where do we go from here?
I think what's concerning is that the RCMP lied about their use of Clearview AI. That to me is very concerning. A police force should be clear about whether or not they're using controversial technology. The fact that they said they were using it in child exploitation cases, I think, is really important. But what we find is that they only used it in 5 or 6% of the cases. So what were they using the other technology, exploitation of this technology? And that is the concern about a technology this powerful. This was a company there were many allegations and concerns and red flags whether this company was breaching Canadian law, and yet the RCMP did not do due diligence. What we need to have is actually judicial oversight. This technology could be used to benefit us and to protect children. So we need judicial oversight. It would be fairly straightforward for the police to get that. They have enormous tools right now, as the privacy commissioner says, to track people, to gather information, but they chose not to go to judicial oversight. They chose to use it. They chose to use it in all manner of means that we don't know, and they lied about it, and that's concerning. I also want to say, in terms of the Pornhub thing, what concerned me with the Pornhub questions that I asked the RCMP was that we have a law, the mandatory reporting law, and the RCMP were not interested in having a company follow that law. They gave them a voluntary compliance code. If we have laws in the land, they should be respected. You can't just take the word of a company, especially a controversial company like Clearview AI or Pornhub, at their face. And that's what the RCMP did. So the RCMP needs to do better in this.
Yeah. And just in terms of my follow-up, the Therrien today made comments saying, that he would like to see parliamentarians more engaged in this, that it has to go to a law. But I mean, specifically, you seem, in the 1970s, we passed laws that if police want to, bug somebody's phone, it goes through a judge. Why is this not happening right now in the current parliament? Why are we not talking about a Part 6 of the criminal code for Clearview AI and other similar technologies?
I have attempted in this parliament to get a serious study into facial recognition technology at the ethics committee. We've never been able to get it underway because of the multiple levels of the numerous cases of filibustering we saw. But in terms of the new privacy legislation, what really concerns me about C11 is Mr. Therrien has been very clear. He feels with the changes the Liberals are bringing in, it would be impossible for him to find a company like Clearview AI guilty. And I think that that's really, really concerning, because we're talking about the technology. We're talking about whether or not that technology is exploitive and intrusive, but we're also talking about the kind of companies that will be selling this technology on the market. And we need to have very clear rules protecting Canadian privacy. And in that, we can also have clear rules about judicial oversight, so that if the technology is used, it's used for proper purposes. And it looks like the Liberals are dropping the ball on this, and certainly the RCMP dropped the ball.
Thanks.
Thank you, Colin. So the next question, it goes to Jesse Brown.
Hi, Jesse Brown with Canada Land News. Charlie, your committee heard serious accusations from Reed Cowan about donor fraud. Your committee asked for proof from the WE organization of the 1,500 schools that they claim to have built. They were not able to account for the whereabouts of those schools. There were accusations made by members of the committee of the Kielburgers perhaps finding themselves in contempt of Parliament for perjury. What repercussions? I know there are many Canadians who volunteered or raised money or gave money to this organization. I think that Canadians have a lot of questions. You say that in 10 months of study, the committee was unable to figure out where the commercial enterprise stopped and the charity began, or how money moved between them. And I'm not sure that we've come out of this with any clearer idea of that. I can tell you that the journalists have more trouble. We don't have the ability to procure documents. Where does this end? I know that you and your family has been involved with this organization. They've been active in Canada for decades, and there are legitimate questions about their finances. I'm wondering what consequences, repercussions, investigations are going to follow, or if this is the end of the inquiries.
Well, I thank you for the question. And to be clear, a parliamentary study is not out there to find guilt. It's about to get answers. We looked into, for example, Baylis Medical as part of, because a number of questions were raised about that and a number of other projects. And we thought, okay, there's not much to see here. And we put that in our report. With the WE group, I fully expected that we would get a pretty much clear set of answers from the get-go. This is a group with 25 years of experience. The number of schools they claim to have built would be the equivalent of about a new school every 5 days for 25 years. That's something they should have been able to answer, and answer so definitively that there would have been no more questions. Instead, we spent about 9 months trying to get answers. Financially, Mr. Victor Lee never showed up. I mean, apparently he was sick, but the documents that we got were not, to me, credible. And on the schools, we got a bunch of pictures, but we had no information. How do you build a school without being able to say where it is, how many students are involved? This is something that charities know and understand and can answer those questions right away. And we were never able to get a sense of exactly what happened with the donors. How many schools were they overselling schools? How many schools may have been, been possibly sold to the same to different groups of donors? And that came up because it was a question about the due diligence. Was this a group that we actually could fulfill the means and the contract? The Reed Cowan testimony, I think, shocked everybody. But then we had a number of international reports, questions in Africa that weren't answered. And the Kielburger brothers showed to me a real disregard for Parliament. They seemed to think that they didn't have to answer these questions. They accused us of this witch hunt. And we're talking about over $500 million of Canadian money. We need to know the group that it's going to. So right now, we still, after 10 months, have no real clue of how this operation, the finances, who owns what's for profit, what's personal. We don't have a picture. And so one of our recommendations is that in future, if there's any more deals signed with the We Group by the Canadian government, there has to be an independent audit where they can actually verify how the money runs through that organization.
Do you have a follow-up question, Jesse?
I do have a follow-up. Given that the Kielburgers have announced their intention to close their Canadian charity, why is the recommendation limited to the possibility of before further grants can be awarded? Even if no further grants are awarded, if the charity doesn't exist anymore, how then are we to get answers for 25 years of operations, of which we have some really serious questions about what was actually happening?
I think we were reflecting the limits of our committee and what we could actually accomplish and suggest. So we had to say our report is to Parliament and to the Canadian government. But I will say, I've been 17 years on parliamentary committees, and we've dealt with some pretty tough operators. I have never been in a situation where we've had to threaten 4 legal summons to one group to appear, and this is a charity. I've never had a problem getting documents or getting answers when Parliament puts its will, and Parliament has a right. This is we work on behalf of the Canadian people. This is not this, outrageous witch hunt that the Kielburger Group and their media team have posted. This was about getting answers. If they could have answered those questions last July, we would never have followed up with anything, but we were never able to actually get a picture of what was for profit, what was private, and in fact, how many companies do they actually own? If a parliamentary committee can't get that answer, I think there's still a lot of questions. So I'm frustrated that we weren't able to get that for the Canadian people, but we felt with this session of Parliament ending, it was time we had to deliver a report to the Canadian people. So those questions do remain unanswered.
Thank you, Jesse. The next question will go to Ray Fillion. Ray, you can go ahead.
Oui, bonjour.
Oui.
Merci beaucoup. Question pour M. Boulerice sur 2 autres sujets, si vous permettez. J'aimerais avoir votre point de vue sur la sortie de M. Rodriguez ce matin, qui a fait un point de presse pour accuser les conservateurs de faire de l'obstruction, de nuire au bon fonctionnement de la Chambre des communes. Quel est votre point de vue là-dessus? Est-ce qu'il a raison ou est-ce que les libéraux sont à blâmer?
Oui, je pense que les deux vieux partis politiques ici en Chambre sont à blâmer. Les conservateurs ne sont pas blancs comme neige, mais il y a des choses qui avancent. Le comité patrimoine, le comité environnement, le comité agriculture, il y a des choses qui vont bien. Je pense que M. Rodriguez est en train de placer la table pour déclenchement éventuel d'élections en s'amusant, en jetant le blâme sur les conservateurs. Ça ressemble plus à une stratégie préélectorale.
Très bien. L'autre sujet, c'est le G7. La question du partage des vaccins sera discutée. Hier, il y a le président Biden qui a annoncé que les États-Unis vont donner un demi-milliard de doses à 92 pays. Est-ce que le Canada doit annoncer dès maintenant ce qu'il entend faire ou c'est trop tôt selon vous?
Non, on fait partie du G7 comme pays riche. On a une responsabilité. Et puis, je pense que tout le monde doit être conscient qu'on ne sera pas en sécurité tant que l'ensemble du monde ne sera pas en sécurité. On ne sera pas en sécurité tant que tout le monde sur la planète ne sera pas bien vacciné et qu'on pourra reprendre les échanges économiques, commerciaux, touristiques, etc. Donc, notre santé et notre sécurité dépend aussi de celle des autres pays. Et là, je pense que M. Trudeau doit annoncer quelque chose.
Trustee Gray. The next question goes to Brian Carney.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my question. Back to the RCMP report. The requirements the RCMP agreed to per the Privacy Commissioner to implement was oversight and assess privacy before implementing technology were already in place, including a requirement to report to the public. This new agreement also seems to be non-binding and unenforceable. And we've also seen that the RCMP have purchased a number of other technologies that have used facial recognition, including that scrape from social media. So it seems likely that we're going to continue this sort of cycle of outrage and year-long inquiries. So I just wonder what's next? You mentioned the need for judicial oversight, and what actual legislation can the current government introduce to get this kind of law in place? And are there any plans to do that?
These are really, really important questions. The fact that the RCMP lied publicly about their use of Clearview AI, to me, is a real red flag. We've had a number of scandals with the RCMP recently. We need to know that the nation's police force respects the law. That should just be a given. We know that this technology is very controversial, and its ability to be abused is so evident. It is not in compliance with Canadian law right now, the way it is being used. And I think it would have been clear that the RCMP knew that. The RCMP did have standards in place. They ignored it. This is not good enough. But what worries me is that the tools that we would expect the government to use, C11, the new update of the PIPEDA bill, should be putting these protections in place to get us protection in the world of surveillance capitalism and big data. But instead, we actually see in C11, the provisions are in place to undermine the ability of the Privacy Commissioner to launch these kind of investigations, as he did with Clearview AI, to hold companies to account, and perhaps also be able to hold the RCMP to account, because it looks like the Liberals are on the track to making these technologies available and legal for police. And I'm very concerned about that.
Brian, do you have a follow-up?
That's okay. Thank you.
Okay, the next question goes to Estelle at Radio Canada. Estelle, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you're still with us.
Oh, sorry, I was talking with my mute on. Bon, alors la question est pour M. Boulerice, c'est concernant le rapport du comité permanent de l'éthique sur les activités de Oui. On sait que l'organisme a cessé ses opérations au Canada. Ce qu'on recommande, entre autres, c'est de faire une analyse indépendante sur ces activités avant qu'un autre contrat soit donné. Est-ce qu'on ne devrait pas tout simplement... en fait, pourquoi ne pas élargir ça à la période, à l'ensemble des activités là, et pas seulement pour la suite des choses?
Je pense que le comité a fait les recommandations qui étaient dans la limite de son mandat puis de ses pouvoirs aussi, c'est-à-dire d'essayer de prévenir pour l'avenir. Je pense qu'ils ont quand même dressé un tableau très préoccupant des relations entre les libéraux et puis les dirigeants de We Charity, les Kilburger, puis la proximité, le copinage. On voit toujours ça avec les libéraux. Encore une fois, c'était là. Et si je peux me permettre, en plus, les libéraux qui avaient choisi un organisme de charité qui était incapable d'offrir le service en français, même pour le faire au Québec. Alors, ça montrait à quel point on voulait récompenser les amis. Je pense qu'on a soulevé beaucoup de pierres dans les travaux de ce comité-là, mais je pense qu'on avait un regard aussi sur l'avenir, malgré le fait que oui, We Charity a cessé officiellement ses activités, mais qui sait, peut-être qu'un jour renaîtra de ses cendres.
Donc, vous, au NPD, qu'est-ce que vous allez faire avec ce rapport-là pour la suite des choses? Quel genre de suivi vous comptez faire?
Bien, je pense que, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, je pense qu'il y a des recommandations qui sont intéressantes, qui sont sur le fait qu'on devrait avoir des examens plus systématiques pour vérifier, avant qu'on donne un contrat, s'il y a un potentiel conflit d'intérêts, au lieu de juste agir par la suite, une fois que le mal est fait. Je pense que le rapport du comité vise particulièrement le ministre des Finances, mais également l'ensemble du cabinet quand un contrat d'une telle ampleur est donné. Mais ça montre à quel point les parlementaires ont perdu confiance envers les libéraux quand tu ne peux pas te fier au bon jugement des ministres et tu es obligé de leur faire passer un examen de conflit d'intérêts avant d'accorder un contrat. Les libéraux nous ont amenés très bas en ce qui concerne l'éthique.
Merci, Estelle. The last question will go to Jesse Knockert.
Yes, hello. This question is for Mr. Angus in regards to the pandemic spending report.
Yes.
In the report, there was a call for real powers to investigate to be granted to the Federal Lobbying Commissioner and for the Federal Ethics Commissioner, similarly to be given more tools to sanction public office holders. Could you elaborate just for me, please, on what kind of real powers and what kind of additional tools you're envisioning for those individuals?
Well, I think one of the questions that we had in this study is what does one actually have to do to break the lobbying law in Ottawa in 2021? We see that the Kielburger brothers had extensive insider access, particularly in the finance minister's office. The ethics commissioner raised serious questions about this, the fact that they could go into the ethics to the finance minister's office and the introduction was, hey girl, that the finance minister's office were doing work for the Kielburgers and none of this was registered to lobby. And it doesn't seem that the lobbying commissioner believes that the laws were broken because of the loopholes is concerning. The fact that Mr. McNaughton from Palantir could be found guilty by the ethics commissioner for coming back as a public office holder and start making all kinds of contacts on behalf of the company. He was working for Palantir. The ethics commissioner can find that's a problem, but the lobbying commissioner gives him a pass. So obviously the lobbying rules are really, really broken. We also need, I think, to have some higher standards of rules in this country in terms of what ministers can get away with, because, you know, we saw Minister Bill Morneau had over $40,000 in flights paid for by the Kielburgers while he was hosting events at their building. His staff were helping them out on all kinds of projects, side projects. This is not how Ottawa's supposed to work. It's not about who you know in the PMO. We thought when we brought in the Accountability Act that we would close down a lot of these loopholes, but obviously the loopholes are there, so we need to strengthen them.
Do you have a follow-up question, Jesse?
Yes, just one more question, if I may, again, to Mr. Angus. So some of these recommendations, of course, relate to the Conflict of Interest Act. So has there been any consideration amongst the committee to initiate a review of the Conflict of Interest Act in order to get to some of these changes? Is not a review of the Conflict of Interest Act, or sorry, actually I'm thinking of the Lobbying Act. The Lobbying Act. My apologies. Is not a review of the Lobbying Act something that the committee does have the power to initiate of its own accord?
We really need to examine the massive loopholes in the Lobbying Act, because you could drive a truck through them in Ottawa and go out for lunch with your friends afterwards and you'd never get into trouble. Normally, it's the government that instructs the committee to initiate the study, so then the government can report on it and make the changes. Obviously, the Trudeau government do not want the Lobbying Act changed because it's benefiting many of their friends right now. But we need to look at this. And if we do come back in the fall and Mr. Trudeau doesn't pull the pin, I really think the issue of addressing why it was possible a group like the Kielburger group had such massive inside access, and we would never have known if it hadn't been for the work of our committee. We would never have been able to shine a light on this. That's not how politics is supposed to be done. We should have clear rules so that we know who's meeting with ministers and know how contracts are being handed out. It should be pretty transparent, and it's not right now.
But why not just have the committee initiate its own review of the Lobbying Act on its own accord?
It is something we could certainly look at doing. We spent a lot more time on the WE study than we ever dreamed. I mean, we literally were filibustered for the equivalent of 20 meetings. Those meetings could have dealt with issues like facial recognition technology, which was supposed to be studied in this session and wasn't. It could have dealt with the Lobbying Act. So we faced a lot of obstruction, and we had to get this report done. But certainly the loopholes in the Lobbying Act are really egregious right now, and we need to have it looked at. So it's something we'll certainly be considering, or I will be pushing my colleagues to consider.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. So this concludes the press conference. Thank you everyone for joining. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Je vous remercie.